Welcome back to the Argentina Project podcast, brought to you by the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'm your host, Benjamin Gedan.
And I'm your producer, Katie Hopkins.
Since it took 20 years and 40 formal negotiations for Mercosur and the European Union to negotiate a free trade agreement, it's going to take us at least 2 podcast guests to figure out who wins, who loses, and whether this deal will ever actually become a reality for companies in these countries.
Our guests are Monica de Bolle, board member of our Latin American program here at the Wilson Center and the director of the Latin American Studies program at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and George Kopits, a senior scholar here at the Wilson Center and a former head of Hungary's Fiscal Council. Before we dive into the interview, some background. The long-awaited Mercosur-European Union agreement is here. Finally, after 20 long years of negotiations. Good timing since low-rise jeans and Polaroids are back in style. When these talks started, I was starting solid foods. On to the basics. Mercosur, the common market of the South, is a trade bloc made up of Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. Created in 1991, back when the Soviet Union was still singing its swan song, the whole idea was to integrate South America's biggest economies and to strike trade deals with other regions. That was a bold agenda, considering the region has a long history of protectionism. 1 out of 2 isn't bad, though. At least initially, trade rapidly increased between Mercosur countries, but the bloc failed spectacularly at integrating with the rest of the planet. It imposed super high tariffs on imports from outside the bloc, barred members from going rogue with bilateral trade agreements, and struggled to sign agreements with outsiders. Well, until now. The deal itself hasn't been shared in its entirety, but here's what we know. It covers 780 million people and $21 trillion in economic activity. The depth and pace of liberalization varies, which is not surprising. Europe is anxious about competing with South American ag exports, and South America is equally as terrified about competing with European manufacturing goods. Finally, the agreement must be ratified by every country, and opposition has already emerged on both sides of the Atlantic. Got it? Okay, now on to the interview.
Greetings, George, Monica. We won't go too deeply into the history, although there's obviously a lot of water under the bridge when it comes to Mercosur and the European Union. Let me just start out with whether this is, in fact, as big a deal as it appears to be, to me at least. I mean, it's a moment of rising protectionism globally. The deal covers, quite a lot of people, 780 million, quite a lot of economic activity, $21 trillion. George, let me start with you. For the Europeans, is this a significant achievement?
It is indeed. Not so much in terms of the huge volumes of imports and exports, which are important, but it's not really so much the issue, particularly in the short term. I think the main issue in the short term, because we have to divide the short and the long term. In the short term, it's a geopolitical victory signaling that rules-based trading arrangements are indeed still part of the agenda for many countries. And that's an important message, of course, to the U.S., and then there is the UK with at the threshold of Brexit. It's also important for the UK to get the message that, hey, we can do better as 28 countries in liberalizing trade on a rules-based basis with many other countries, and particularly with Latin America.
And George, this is not the first time in the Donald Trump era that the rest of the international community has sent a message that free trade would continue to advance within multilateral agreements. I'm referencing, of course, the Trans-Pacific Partnership that was signed in Santiago, Chile, shortly into the Trump administration, excluding the United States, but including Japan and several Latin American countries and others in Asia, correct?
And then there was the agreement with Canada as well. And these are not really one-off deals, and certainly it's a rejection of protectionism and nationalism in world trade. So we are preserving the existing international framework consistent with WTO rules. And even beyond that, what is really interesting in this agreement is that it goes beyond the traditional format of a free trade arrangement, the textbook model, but it goes heavily into non-tariff barriers. And in fact, it even advances a little bit the ball towards single market rules and regulations of the EU and bring them into the ballpark with Latin America.
Monica, you've looked carefully at the details that have emerged related to this agreement. There's questions as to whether, in fact, this is, what we would consider a modern free trade agreement, whether this rises to the level of the kind of agreement that the United States, for example, typically demands of its trading partners, the kinds of requirements that were incorporated in the Trans-Pacific Partnership that we discussed earlier. What's your assessment so far about the quality and ambition of this agreement?
So let me first agree with George. It is really ambitious, and I think it does present exactly with that opportunity for countries to bypass, the protectionism and rising nationalism that we're seeing in the world, and in particular what we're seeing coming out of the U.S. with the Trump administration. So it is indeed very, very significant. The formal full text of the agreement hasn't yet been made available because, of course, as it goes with these types of agreements, it has to go through judicial reviews, legal reviews, technical reviews, and all of that by the different countries before we can actually see the full text. But the EU and Brazil and Argentina also in Portuguese and in Spanish, and the EU did this in English, they have released sort of summaries of what's been agreed. And the EU, the one that the EU released, I think is the most comprehensive one, the most comprehensive document, and it's the one where you can get a bit of a taste, not much in the way of detail, but a bit of a taste of what's actually in the agreement. And I would say that, the agreement goes way beyond market access. So when negotiations first started back in the 90s, that was a time when trade liberalization and anything to do with trade agreements was mostly about market access, access for one's exports in a given market. And since then, we have seen, this broader, this enlargement of what trade agreements actually are. There are a whole set of other issues, of course, non-tariff barriers, technical barriers to trade, regulatory convergence, standards on environment, on labor issues, all the gamut of everything that we see in CPTPP and that we also see in some of the FTAs that the U.S. has signed with other countries, including Latin American countries, other than Mercosur countries. So it appears that, at least from the preliminary text of the agreement in principle, that the EU-Mercosur agreement has a number of these things, or includes a number of these things as well. So in a sense, it is a modern trade agreement, but it is a modern trade agreement that will fit everything into the mold of what is done in the EU. So in other words, countries are agreeing to fit into the EU template. And that's, I think, an important thing to underscore.
Go ahead, George.
It's a good template. It's recognized as a good template. It's not perfect, but it should benefit these countries, namely in the Mercosur, over time.
Yeah, agreed.
Monica, I want to know why it took so long to achieve this. This was under negotiation in fits and starts for 2 decades, at least 40 formal rounds of conversations. I mean, is it simply the discontinuities in trade policy in Latin America from one administration to the next? Is it the continued resistance of industry in Latin America that doesn't feel ready for prime time and to compete with European imports? What explains the length of time that it took for what had been a trading bloc that was meant to sign just this type of agreement?
So there are, as with all things, there are so many moving parts and so many variables to this. On the Latin American side, I would say that there are a few issues. So one issue is just the overall on the Mercosur side, particularly Brazil and Argentina. These are 2 countries that have been historically protectionist. Not only that, they were the 2 countries in the region that have championed and, in a way, continue to champion, though that seems to be going away, import substitution. So, they have been very
unsuccessfully.
Very unsuccessfully, but that hasn't stopped them. So even though it has been very unsuccessful, that hasn't stopped them at all. And that was one of the things standing in the way. If you don't give up that kind of mentality, then you really can't negotiate a trade agreement. So that was one stumbling block. A second stumbling block was that the Mercosur countries wanted access to European agricultural markets. And of course, Europe has always been very protectionist of its agricultural markets. So given that, Brazil and Argentina in particular are extremely competitive when it comes to agricultural products, there was fear on the part of the EU that opening markets too much or granting these countries a lot of access would amount to unfair competition in a sense with their own exports. And so, many times negotiations stalled over issues to do with agriculture. Then you've got the political cycles, which in Latin America have been quite, as always, quite significant. So in the 90s, you had generally, both in Brazil and in Argentina, governments that were somewhat pro-market, I would say pro-market overall. And then, suddenly that changed. In the beginning of the 2000s, Argentina had a major crisis, which also had its own effects on the negotiations. But after the crisis was more or less resolved in Argentina, you had the Kirchners coming in, and the Kirchners had a particular view of how to run the economy that wasn't altogether consistent with trade agreements for trade openness. And on the Brazilian side, you had the Workers' Party under former President Lula, who was really focused on South-South trade and South-South diplomacy, as opposed to making deals with developed countries and with developed economies. So the focus was different there too. So these political cycles, I think, also kind of got in the way of the negotiations progressing and the negotiations proceeding. Now, especially since 2015, 2016, when Argentina elected Macri and a pro-market government and a pro-liberalization government, and Brazil didn't elect anyone, but impeached the president and put in place someone who, Temer in this case, the vice president, who was also pro-trade, pro-liberalization. Things then started to move a little bit faster and negotiations got kind of back on track. And then I think what made it all come together was something that George referred to, which I'll refer to back again. Trump coming into office and basically turning trade upside down really motivated everybody to get things done and just conclude these negotiations once and for all. So there's a combination of factors over time, and of course I'm missing a ton of them when I make these generalized statements about things. But I think at least these three elements, the import substitution mentality, the access to agricultural markets in the EU, and then the political cycles in Latin America, which explain, I think, a lot of the reasons for why it took so long.
Now, Monica, you lay out a scenario where, for a variety of factors, there's been sort of a convergence of to some degree, public, certainly political elite support for this trade agreement. George, we here on this podcast talk a lot about Latin America, where we're well aware that there is not 100% consensus on the subject. In fact, in Argentina, there's a presidential election in October. The same Kirchnerista movement that Monica referenced is now angling to return in a more moderate form to power, and it's already declared itself in opposition to this agreement. Give us the European dynamics, though. What is involved in having this approved? Does it need parliamentary approval in every member state? And has anyone spoken out already in concern, particularly on the ag sensitivities that Monica talked about earlier?
The sensitivities are there, of course. And, before we leave Latin America, I'm quite involved with Argentina myself. And what has to be kept in mind is that there is a considerable amount of uncertainty as to the outcome of the next election. Now, the opposition Peronists are pretty much of the old mindset, import substitution. And of course, they want to show a different perspective, and they're lukewarm, if not altogether opposed to this agreement. So, if they don't move fast in the legislature to pass it in Argentina, even before the elections, that could be a problem. But I don't think this is so much of a problem in Brazil. But in the EU, certainly you need 28 legislatures to debate and approve this, and there could be surprises. I wouldn't call it uncertainty, but certainly it's not in the bag. For one thing, the UK has to go along before the end of October, before the exit, no deal or deal, while it is still a full-fledged member. But in addition to that, there could be a monkey wrench that we are not prepared for, and maybe even the Commission is not totally prepared to deal with. And for this, I would just mention the Canadian agreement where the Belgians were actually not happy with it and they rejected it. And it was subject to further negotiation. And now it's just a non-zero probability that something could go wrong. And so that's to be kept in mind. There is grumbling also in France. The agricultural lobby is not really happy with it. Now, it should be noted, I think, that it's not an immediate elimination of trade barriers altogether at all. And there is actually, the devil is in the detail. I agree with Monica that we don't know everything. The stakeholders don't know everything, but we know really a lot. We know that the process of liberalization is gradual. The quotas, for example, that are imposed on imports of agricultural products is quite detailed, the way it's described, how many tons of this and that, how many chocolate bars almost. I mean, I'm kidding. But for example, in the case of passenger vehicles, instead of the 10-year gradual linear reduction, there is a 15-year reduction. This is a very sensitive area for Brazil and Argentina. And there's a grace period of 7 years. So that's coming later. One of the short-term effects of all of this is the potential job losses that can actually happen and are likely to happen, at least in a small way, on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, this is particularly a problematic situation. Well, it won't happen certainly before the elections, but it could get into the campaigning as to how many job losses might suffer Argentina at a time when you have already a fairly high unemployment rate. Argentina in the short run is not well positioned economically to take full advantage of the benefits and mitigate the costs at this time. I mean, let's be very candid about that. Brazil, I think, is better positioned for a whole number of reasons. They are really more export-oriented economy to begin with. We fly on Embraer aircraft here in the U.S., in the EU. So they're I mean, this is just an example, but they are better positioned to deal with it.
Yeah, I want to conclude with a bit more conversation on that subject, Monica, with you. You've already written about this aspect of the trade agreement, meaning within the moments of triumph of negotiating this deal and all of the opportunity that trade liberalization in the long term provides, you also have this great concern that Mercosur countries, when it comes to industrial goods, are frankly not competitive, and that the resistance is not just laziness among the region's manufacturers, but an actual realization that competing with European manufactured imports will be difficult, at least for now. How do you see this playing out? Are these governments capable of the kind of industrial policies necessary? Are these businesses agile enough? Is there enough domestic competition that they can prepare to take advantage of this agreement? Or, will we see an eventual blowback against trade again in the region, what has happened elsewhere and created this moment of protectionism in the U.S. and Europe and elsewhere?
So I think the potential for some kind of blowback is there because, when it comes to Brazilian industry or Brazilian manufacturing, for example, even though it's very diverse and Brazil does have many sectors, many manufacturing sectors and so on, when we try to sort of look at which ones are really competitive, we keep coming back to Embraer every time. We talk about Embraer and we can't really seem to find, another example like Embraer because there really isn't one when it comes to manufacturing. As I was saying before, the whole import substitution stuff, what it has really done is that it's made manufacturing, both in Brazil and Argentina, very uncompetitive over the years. And that hasn't changed. So there is, I think, at the moment, there's a lot of euphoria coming from all sectors in Brazil, and I'm speaking specifically of Brazil, the country that I'm closest to, regarding this agreement. But I think there's going to be some kind of day of reckoning when things start coming into force. And what George was saying is very true. This is not coming into force. First of all, there are the stumbling blocks that we need to clear. But even after that, it's coming into force gradually over a period of 10 years for most things. And for cars, passenger vehicles, it's coming into force over a period of 15 years. So there's that to consider. But even then, I think that, there is the potential for some sectors of the Brazilian economy, which are particularly uncompetitive, to start to view this with some level of mistrust. Of course, there is also the potential for an agreement such as this to significantly upgrade manufacturing and manufacturing practices, to provide the technological transfers that a lot of sectors need, and to really, give the opportunity for upgrading and modernization that is much, much needed in the industrial sectors of the two countries that we've talked about, both Brazil and Argentina. But let me mention one area that we have not talked about, which could be a hurdle, both from the Brazilian side as well as from the European side, and that has nothing to do with industry, and it has something to do with agriculture, but mostly it has to do with the environment. It is certainly a lot easier for Brazil right now to ratify this deal in Congress because everybody sees how valuable it's going to be, and the Brazilian Congress is positioned to, I think, go ahead with the deal and ratify it. The Bolsonaro administration is a very strange administration when it comes to environmental policy. And there's been a quite significant dismantling of environmental regulations, environmental agencies that are responsible for supervising all sorts of environmental policy in Brazil. And this is something that could very well get in the way of this deal getting signed if from the European side there's a lot of mistrust regarding the Brazilians. And they have reason to be mistrustful because, as I said, these things are happening right now.
George, before we conclude, do you see that as well as a factor? Certainly the French are quite committed to the climate accord. And if they see Brazil in particular moving away from it, even if it remains a signatory, they've suggested that could be a stumbling block to the trade deal.
It could be a stumbling block, but I think it's not unsurmountable. On this, I don't believe that they are going to have a month-by-month schedule of how to implement this, And just in most countries, except perhaps in California, it starts out with a declaration of good intentions, and then that has to be followed up by various policy tools. But I don't think that the EU is going to expect, or even the French, an instant set of policy measures in this particular area. I'm a little bit more concerned about the political blowback that Monica describes. And one thing which I see missing in the Latin American cases is really a plan or intentions on introducing something like the Trade Expansion Act of 1962.
And sure, given the fact of the agreement, given the long phase-in period, ideally, you're right, there will be policies brought to bear that will limit potential blowback and will help industry in South America truly prepare. Listen, let me thank you both for your generosity and your insights. Monica, this was excellent. I appreciate your perspective. George, you get a special thanks because I understand you're talking to us from Cape Cod and you were willing to take some time for this conversation.
It's tough, but I can handle it without any time difference,
I really appreciate your being on our podcast.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care. And thankfully, our producer is a wonderful editor.
That's me, Katie Hopkins. If you enjoyed the show, subscribe to the Argentina Project podcast on SoundCloud and sign up for our weekly newsletter at wilsoncenter.org/weekly-asado.